During World War II, when the United States dropped the world's first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, a resident was sitting on the steps outside the Japanese Sumitomo Bank. Seconds later, the man died or evaporated, but he left a shadow in his own form and shape over the stone he was sitting on. This was not the only shadow, although it was the most famous. Countless black shadows of people and objects such as bicycles were found scattered across the sidewalks and buildings in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the atomic explosions over each city on August 6 and 9, 1945. But what is the secret of these shadows? How were they formed, and are they still there today? The secret of the shadows. According to the Live Science website, the heat from the explosion of the two nuclear bombs was so intense that it bleached everything in the area of the explosion, leaving eerie nuclear shadows of human waste where citizens once were. These shadows are a horrific reminder of the hundreds of thousands of people who lost their lives in this unprecedented act, as victims were burned in the boiling light of the atomic bomb, leaving a shadow that was a terrifying remnant of their final moments. The atomic weapons used in the 1945 attacks were fueled by uranium-235 and plutonium-239, which released enormous amounts of heat and very short-wave gamma radiation. The gamma radiation released by the explosion of atomic bombs is transmitted as thermal energy that can reach 5,538 degrees Celsius. When this high energy hits an object, such as a bicycle or a person, the object absorbs the energy, shielding objects behind or in the shadow, while the heat whitens everything around the shadow. Referring to the famous shadow outside the Sumitomo Bank, which was only about 280 meters from the epicenter of the explosion in Hiroshima, it is believed that the person died instantly. Explaining the shadow, Drive. Michael Hartshorn, Curator Emeritus at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, New Mexico, says the reason is due to the intense light and heat emitted by the bomb. He says on the British Mirror website that when the bomb explodes, intense light and heat spread, and objects and people in its path protect those behind them by absorbing the light and energy. This means that the ground in the shadow was not as wide as the surrounding area. The shadow preserved the original color of the place, while the surrounding light bleached the concrete and stone around the shadow. In other words, those eerie shadows are actually what the sidewalk or building looked like before the nuclear explosion. It's just that the rest of the surfaces were bleached, making the regularly colored area appear as a dark shadow. In the accounts of some of the survivors, the scene at 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, was described as a hell unlike anything humanity had ever seen on Earth. Everything in the Japanese city of Hiroshima burned. People, birds, and animals died. Trees were burned and buildings were destroyed. The effects remained for years. From the highest point of view, as the death plane flew at an altitude of more than 32,000 feet, Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the American plane Enola Gay, which carried out the first atomic bombing in history, said that the scene was like a big bright flash. We saw the glow that emanated at the moment of the explosion and tasted the bullets. Between the scene of what happened on the ground and what came out of the sky, the wound of the bombing of the cities of Hiroshima, Southwest, and 3 days later the bombing of the city of Nagasaki with an atomic bomb by the United States, has not healed despite the 76th anniversary of its occurrence. The two events, which were considered among the most prominent stations of World War II, were the green light for the beginning of the era of weapons of mass destruction, and the possibility of humanity's annihilation, with the increased likelihood of their use in light of the frenzied race to acquire them among major countries over the following decades. As historians say, what happened in Japan? How did the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki experience the horrors of the first and only atomic bombing in the history of humanity? And to what extent did the shrapnel and repercussions of the explosion continue to affect the lives of the Japanese and the world? By July 1945, Germany had surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. Japan, however, refused to submit to the terms outlined in the Allies Potsdam Declaration. It appeared to American leaders that the only way to compel Japan's unconditional surrender was to invade and conquer the Japanese home islands. Although an estimated 300,000 Japanese civilians had already died from starvation and bombing raids, Japan's government showed no sign of capitulation. Instead, American intelligence intercepts revealed that by August 2nd, Japan had already deployed more than 560,000 soldiers and thousands of suicide planes and boats on the island of Kyushu to meet the expected American invasion of Japan. Additional reports correctly surmised that the Japanese military intended to execute all American prisoners in Japan in the event of an Allied landing. These frightening figures portended a costlier battle for the United States than any previously fought during the war. By comparison, U.S. forces suffered 49,000 casualties, including 12,000 men killed in action, when facing less than 120,000 Japanese soldiers during the battle for the island of Okinawa from April to June of 1945. At least 110,000 Japanese soldiers and more than 100,000 Okinawan civilians, a third of the island's pre-war population, also perished in the campaign. American casualties on Okinawa weighed heavily on the minds of American planners who looked ahead to the invasion of Japan. Japan's leaders hoped to prevail, not by defeating American forces, but by inflicting massive casualties and thereby breaking the resolve of the American public. This was the situation that confronted American President Harry S. Truman in the summer of 1945 when he authorized the use of the world's first atomic bomb. In light of intelligence reports about Japan's commitment to continue fighting, Truman and his military advisors were determined to use every weapon at their disposal in order to bring the war to an immediate end. Consequently, neither Truman nor any of his advisors ever debated if the atomic bombs should be used, only how and where they should be used. In the spring of 1945, the American government convened a committee of scientists and military officers to determine how best to use the bombs. This group unanimously declared that there was no guarantee that demonstrating the bombs to the Japanese in a deserted area would convince Japanese leaders to surrender. It was vital that Japan be convinced to surrender as fast as possible because the United States had just 2 atomic bombs available in July 1945 and additional weapons would not be ready to deploy for several more weeks. Meanwhile, thousands of Chinese, American, and Japanese soldiers continued to die each day the war continued. Consequently, Truman approved the long-standing plans for the U.S. Army Air Force to drop atomic bombs on a list of pre-selected Japanese cities. The list of targets excluded Tokyo and Kyoto because of their political and historic importance. Instead, the intended target of the first bomb was Hiroshima, a fan-shaped city of approximately 550,000 people that occupied the estuary of the Oda River. The city was also home to the headquarters of the Japanese army that defended the island of Kyushu as well as a number of war industries. At 2:45 a.m. on Monday, August 6, 1945, 3 American B-29 bombers of the 509th Composite Group took off from an airfield on the Pacific island of Tinian, 1,500 miles south of Japan. Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted the lead bomber, Enola Gay, which carried a nuclear bomb nicknamed Little Boy. Despite the bomb's moniker, it weighed nearly 10,000 pounds. As a result, the overloaded Enola Gay used more than 2 miles of runway to get aloft. At 7:15 a.m., the bomber crew armed the bomb, and the plane began its ascent to the bombing altitude of 31,000 feet. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima, Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto awoke at 5 a.m. Hiroshima time, which was an hour behind Tinian time. Tanimoto was the pastor of the Hiroshima Methodist Church, and a small man, quick to talk, laugh, and cry. Tanimoto was a thoughtful and cautious man who had sent his wife and baby to the relative safety of a northern suburb. Tanimoto remained in the city to remove the transportable objects in his church to the safety of a suburban estate. He had slept poorly because of several air raid warnings the previous night. Hiroshima had not yet endured an American bombing raid, but its good fortune was not expected to last. That morning, Tanimoto had agreed to help a friend move a large armoire filled with clothes out to the suburbs. As the 2 men trundled a piece of furniture through the streets, they heard an air raid siren go off. The alarm sounded every morning when American weather planes flew overhead, so the men were not particularly worried. They continued on with their handcart through the city streets. When the pair reached their destination, there was no sound of planes. The morning was still, the place was cool and pleasant. At 8:14 a.m. Hiroshima time, the Enola Gay arrived over the city. The Ioi Bridge, which Bombardier Thomas Farraby used as an aiming point, was clearly visible through the plane's bomb sight. Farabee took control of the bomber and opened the bomb bay doors. Just after 8:15 a.m., Farabee released Little Boy from its restraints and the bomb fell away from the Enola Gay. The plane jumped nearly 10 feet at the sudden loss in weight. Tibbets immediately resumed control of the plane and banked it sharply on a 155-degree turn. He had practiced this difficult maneuver for months because he had been instructed that he had less than 45 seconds to get his plane clear of the subsequent explosion. Not even the scientists who designed the bomb were sure if the Enola Gay would survive the shock waves from the blast. Little Boy fell almost 6 miles in 43 seconds before detonating at an altitude of 2,000 feet. The bomb exploded with the force of more than 15,000 tons of TNT directly over a surgical clinic, 500 feet from the Ioi Bridge. Less than 2% of the bomb's uranium achieved fission, but the resulting reaction engulfed the city in a blinding flash of heat and light. The temperature at ground level reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a second. The bomb vapor In the minutes, hours, and days that followed the bombing, survivors in Hiroshima tried desperately to locate loved ones and care for the thousands of wounded. Some people exhibited horrible burns, while others who outwardly appeared unscathed later died painful deaths from radiation poisoning. Thousands of people were buried in the debris of their homes. Most structures in the city had been constructed of wood with tile roofs. All but a handful of concrete structures in the city center had been completely leveled. President Harry Truman was aboard the cruiser USS Augusta on his way back from the Potsdam Conference when he learned of the bomb's successful detonation. He immediately shared the news with his advisors and the ship's crew. As the information was broadcast around the world, Allied soldiers around the globe felt as though they had received a reprieve from a death sentence. The end of World War II finally appeared to be in sight. The threat of nuclear weapons to humanity remains the same whether those who possess these weapons are superpowers, small regional powers, or even terrorist organizations. The only solution lies in all powers, both great and small, getting rid of these weapons and refraining from producing them. But what is happening is the opposite, as other countries are seeking to obtain weapons of mass destruction, which means that the world is threatened as long as the production of these weapons continues, even if their production is for defensive and preventive purposes, as some countries claiming. Because in both cases, the matter is the same, as nuclear weapons are preventive and offensive at the same time, and the threat to the world exists in both cases. The problem also lies in the fact that countries that have not signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Weapons of Mass Destruction are not subject to these international agreements. Regional powers such as India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea have sought and are seeking to establish the production of weapons of mass destruction or can be used to produce these weapons. The superpowers and the International Atomic Energy Agency have dealt and are dealing with these young nuclear countries with double standards and in accordance with a policy of double standards.